Arizona Territory, 1883. The sun had barely lifted over the Dragoon Mountains when Malcolm Keaton spotted the white lace dragging in the dirt. It was not the kind of thing a man expected to find in the middle of the high desert, especially not with a woman still in it. She was alone, standing barefoot on the cracked earth beside a half-dead mesquite tree, her wedding dress torn at the hem and dust clinging to every fold. Her veil had blown off, snagged on a cactus a few feet away. Her hands were clenched tight, like she was holding herself together. Malcolm pulled his gelding to a halt. "You all right, miss?" The woman didn't answer. She just looked at him, eyes wide and red-rimmed like she had not blinked in a while. Her lips parted, then closed again. He swung out of the saddle, boots crunching the dry ground. "You lost," she nodded slowly, then shook her head. "I was supposed to be married today, in Tombstone." Malcolm's brows drew together. Tombstone was a hard 2-day ride from here, and there were no wagons, no horses, not even tracks near her. "You walk all this way." "I ran," she said. Her voice cracked. "He left me at the church." Malcolm looked her over again. She was young, no more than 20, but not soft. There was grit in her, even if her hands shook. Her cheeks were streaked with tears and dust, and she had a fresh scrape across one knee. "What's your name?" he asked gently. Clara Kincaid." "I'm Malcolm Keaton." He took off his hat and held it against his chest. "Mind if I help you, Clara?" She hesitated, then finally nodded once. "I don't got anywhere to go." "Well," he said, reaching out his hand, "you do now." Clara looked at his hand for a long moment like she wasn't sure she could trust it or him. But then, with a breath that trembled, she took hold of his fingers and gripped them tight. She did not let go. Malcolm brought her back to his ranch just outside Bisbee. It was a small place, carved out of stubborn land, with 2 horses, a few cattle, and a cabin built by his own hands. He had lived alone there for 8 years. Ever since the war, and everything after had taken more than he cared to remember. He gave her his sister's old clothes neatly folded in a trunk he had not opened in years, and made her tea on the stove. She sat at the table like she was not sure how to be a person anymore. "You got family?" he asked. Clara shook her head. "My pa died last spring. Mama passed 2 years before that. I got no one." Malcolm nodded. "You can stay here as long as you need." "Why?" she asked, her voice small. He looked at her. "Because no one should be left in the dirt like that." She stared at him a long time, eyes glassy. Then quietly, "Thank you." By the 3rd day, Clara had found her balance again. She helped feed the chickens, swept the porch, even mended a torn saddlebag without being asked. But she still wore that wedding dress, now washed and drying by the fire. She had no other dress of her own. Malcolm rode into town and bought her one. Blue gingham. Simple and soft. When he handed it to her, she blinked. "You did not have to do that, I know," he said. "But you should have something that's yours." That night, she cooked stew from the beans and salted beef he had, and they ate it by lamplight. She laughed once at something he said, and the sound startled them both, but she did not apologize for it. Clara slept in the bedroom. Malcolm took the cot near the fireplace. It made things easier, safer. But he noticed how she pressed her palm to the doorframe before she turned in, like she was steadying herself. One night, he asked, "You ever think about going back to Tombstone?" "Maybe make a new start there," she shook her head. "It's full of people who watched me stand there alone in white. I would rather scrub rocks than go back." He understood that. He had left Georgia behind for the same reason once. A week passed. Then 2. One morning, Malcolm found Clara sitting on the porch, her hair loose and her eyes thoughtful. She was holding his old harmonica, turning it over in her hands. "Do you play?" he asked. "I used to. My pa taught me." He sat beside her and waited. Slowly, she lifted it to her lips. The notes were shaky at first, but then they smoothed out, low and sweet. Malcolm closed his eyes. When she stopped, she said, "I have not played in years. You should keep doing it. You bring something peaceful to this place." She looked at him, quiet. "You have been alone a long time," he nodded. "Did you love someone?" He looked down at his hands. "A long time ago. She died in childbirth. The baby, too." Clara's breath caught. "I am sorry." He met her eyes. "So am I." Neither spoke for a long time. Then she said, "You are kind, Malcolm." "Not many men are." "I think you are strong, Clara, stronger than you know." She looked like she might cry, but didn't. Instead, she reached out and took his hand again. This time she held it longer. It was not fast, but it was steady. Her laughter came easier. She stopped flinching when thunder cracked. She started humming when she swept the floor. Malcolm found himself watching her more than he should have. The curve of her smile, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she read the old books on his shelf. He tried to ignore it. But one evening, when she burned her hand taking cornbread from the stove, he reached for her instinctively. He ran her fingers under cool water, wrapped the cloth gently. She looked at him, eyes wide again but not scared this time. "I don't know what this is," she whispered. He swallowed. "Me neither, but I am not afraid of it," he smiled, soft and real. "Neither am I." That night she did not close the bedroom door, and he did not sleep on the cot. By early April, the earth around Malcolm's land had begun to soften. The cottonwoods along the wash leafed out in pale green, and Clara took to walking near them in the early hours, when the light was silver and the ground still cool beneath her shoes. She didn't ask permission. She didn't need to. Malcolm watched her from the corral once, leaning on the fence rail with the quiet stillness that had come to mark him. He didn't follow. He didn't call out. He let her go where she pleased, and something in her straightened more each day because of it. When she returned that morning, she held out a sprig of desert mallow, orange blossoms trembling like they weren't meant to be touched. "I found it near the bend," she said. "The bees were thick on it." He took it from her fingers with care. "You ever keep a hive?" "No. But I helped a neighbor once. We'd use pine smoke to calm them." She paused, one hand brushing the edge of her skirt. "I liked the sound they made, like they were always working but not worrying." He tucked the sprig behind the window latch. "Maybe we could set up a box come summer." Her eyes met his steady. "You'd let me help, if you want to." "I do." That evening, Clara pulled the old rocker outside and mended a shirt beneath the porch lantern. Malcolm sharpened tools nearby, the rasp of the file steady against the hush of dusk. When the coyotes started yipping off in the hills, she didn't flinch. She looked up. "I used to think I'd live in a town all my life," she said. "Maybe teach school. I never thought I'd end up here." He set the whetstone down. "Regret it?" "Not once." The way she said it made something shift in him, low and quiet. He went back to the tools, but his hands slowed. 2 days later, he brought her a book he'd found in the bottom of a drawer, an old volume of folk tales, the pages yellowed but intact. She opened it like a gift, and when she sat cross-legged by the hearth to read it aloud, he stayed close, listening to her voice wrap around the words like they were something sacred. "You knew this was here all along?" she asked, turning a page. "I forgot it was there," Clara smiled without looking up. "I don't think you forget much." That night she brushed his hair with slow, thoughtful strokes, her fingers sure and unhurried. He didn't speak, afraid the moment might scatter if he did. Her touch was not possessive or hesitant, it was something else entirely. Belonging, maybe. When she finished, he turned to her. "You sure you want this?" "I wouldn't be here if I didn't." He kissed her like a man who'd waited too long to believe in such things again. By the time the first thunderstorm rolled in from the south, they had settled into a rhythm that neither of them had planned but both of them welcomed. Clara built a garden bed near the porch. Malcolm dug the rows and hauled water from the creek. She planted onions, carrots, and a patch of beans. They worked side by side, hands in the dirt, the kind of quiet between them that didn't need filling. One afternoon, as wind kicked up across the flat and the sky turned the color of gunmetal, Clara stood in the doorway watching the clouds gather. "There's strength in this land," she said. "But it doesn't give it easy." "No," Malcolm said, setting the bridle on its peg, "but you've got some of it in you." She leaned against the frame, arms folded. "You too, though I think yours came from losing things." He didn't answer right away. "Then losing makes you pick what matters." "And what matters to you now?" He stepped forward, closing the space between them. His hand found the edge of her jaw, rough and warm. "You." The rain came down hard that night, drumming the roof till it nearly drowned their voices. They lay in bed listening, her head on his chest, his arm around her back. "I dreamed once of a wedding dress," she said, voice low, "but never what came after." He ran his thumb along her shoulder. "What do you see now?" She looked up at him, eyes soft but sure. "A kitchen that smells like coffee, a porch with 2 chairs, a man who doesn't need to speak every feeling because he shows them. Malcolm touched her cheek. That future's yours, Clara, if you want it. She pressed her lips to his, slow and certain. I already chose it. Outside, the storm passed. The earth drank deep and the desert began to bloom. The days lengthened. The air turned warm enough that Clara left the windows open at night, letting in the grit and scent of creosote. A mockingbird began nesting in the cottonwood near the water trough, and she took to watching it each morning, arms folded against the porch post, hair tied back with a strip torn from an old flour sack. Malcolm came out one morning still dusted with sleep. You always rise before the sun. I used to wait until the church bell, she said. Now I wake when the birds do. He stepped beside her, rubbing his jaw. That bird's got more to say than most folks do. She glanced at him. You complaining? I don't mind a little noise, he said. Long as it's honest. Clara lowered her gaze, then looked toward the horizon. I never knew how quiet a true place could be, not empty quiet, just settled. Malcolm watched her a moment, then went to hitch the wagon. They were due to drive north past the Miller homestead, where a neighbor had offered to trade seed potatoes for some of Malcolm's smoked venison. Clara had insisted on going with him, saying she'd been idle too long. On the trail, she sat beside him, the hem of her skirt brushing his leg each time the wagon shifted. She watched the road, but not with the wariness she'd carried weeks before. Now her eyes scanned the distant ridges with measured calm, as if she belonged to the shape of the land. You ever think about leaving the territory? She asked once the wheels found a steady rhythm. I did, he said, back when I thought I'd buried everything worth staying for. Clara let the words settle before she spoke again. And now I think maybe I hadn't found it yet. She didn't answer, but her hand slid across the seat, settling just beside his. He didn't reach for it, not yet, but the space between them felt less like a space at all. At the Miller place, Clara bartered with Mrs. Miller over a basket of dried apples. She held her side of the conversation with ease, asking about calving and offering advice on keeping weevils out of flour tins. The older woman gave her a long look. You two married? She asked. Malcolm's mouth opened, but Clara beat him to it. Not yet, she said, lifting her chin, but we're building something. The woman nodded. Good, a man can't manage land like this alone, not for long. Back in the wagon, Clara tucked her hands in her lap. I didn't mean to speak for you. You didn't, he said. You just said what I hadn't yet. He glanced at her, gauging the stillness in her. Her gaze held steady on the road ahead. I don't need a preacher to tell me what's real, she said. Wouldn't mind one just the same, Malcolm said, voice low. She tilted her head. You offering? That depends, he said. You accepting? The quiet between them stretched long and full, then she nodded once. I am. They didn't talk more on the ride home. The silence held weight, but it was warm, the kind of silence that didn't ask for filling. That night, Clara took the wedding dress from its folded place in the trunk. She spread it across the bed and ran her fingers over the lace, the way one might touch a memory that no longer hurt. Then she folded it again and placed it back, deeper this time. She turned to Malcolm, who stood just inside the doorway, arms crossed. I want something different this time, she said. No crowds, no altar. He stepped closer. Then we'll speak our vows in the place we built. They married 2 mornings later, beneath the cottonwood where the mockingbirds still sang. A traveling circuit rider agreed to bless the union, an old man with a crooked back and a Bible wrapped in oilskin. Clara wore a dress dyed with walnut hulls, and Malcolm cleaned up in a collar she'd stitched together from linen scraps. Afterward, they shared coffee and biscuits with the Millers and 2 hands from the feed station. The whole thing was done by noon. That evening, Clara stood beside their bed, brushing her hair by lamplight. Malcolm sat on the edge, bootless, watching her. You ever think you'd marry again? She asked. No, he said. Not till you stood in the dust and didn't let go. She turned toward him, brush quiet in her hand. I think I was waiting for someone who wouldn't ask me to be less. I'd never want less of you, he said. Only more days with you in them. She crossed the room and knelt in front of him, her hands resting on his knees. Then take them. All of them? He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, then her mouth, slow and certain. The lamp flickered. The wind outside stirred the cottonwood leaves, and inside nothing was uncertain anymore. The late spring heat settled across the land like a blanket left too long by the fire. By mid-morning, the light turned sharp, and the air shimmered in waves above the hardpan. Clara took to tying a wide-brimmed hat beneath her chin when she worked outside, the crown stitched by hand from scraps of canvas. Malcolm had trimmed the brim for her with his pocket knife, careful not to cut too deep. They kept to their work, each day folding into the next with a kind of quiet certainty. There were fence posts to mend, rows to weed, and cloth sacks to hang beneath the rafters to keep the mice from the flour. Clara started keeping a small ledger in the back of an old almanac, marking what they traded, what they stored, and what she meant to add once the growing paid off. She sat at the table one afternoon, brushing the nib of a stubby pen across the page. "We need more jars. Come summer, I'll be canning every last bean." Malcolm leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You want glass, we'll have to go west. Benson's got a dry goods shop." She looked up. "You think it's worth the ride?" "It is if you're the one asking." They left before sunrise the following morning, Clara riding astride the mule, her skirts gathered up with a twine belt. Malcolm led the way on his gelding, the rifle strapped behind him and a canteen slung over his shoulder. The ride to Benson took hours, the path climbing through thorny hills and saguaro stands. They crossed a dry arroyo just past noon, the riverbed cracked in long veins beneath their mounts. At the general store, Clara bartered for 6 jars, 2 spools of thread, and a small tin of carbolic salve. She held her ground with the shopkeeper, never raising her voice but never giving him the room to argue either. On the ride back, she turned in the saddle and shaded her eyes with one hand. "You ever think about leaving Arizona?" "Used to," he said. "Before I figured out it wasn't the land that hurt me." She didn't press him, didn't nod. Just let the mule pick its way through the shale while the wind pressed down from the north. Near twilight, they stopped to water the animals near a shallow spring. Clara knelt beside the pool, rinsing her hands. When she stood, she wiped them dry on the inside of her skirt and looked at him. "You ever want children?" Malcolm paused, one hand still on the reins. "I did, once. After the war, I thought maybe I'd have a house with a roof that didn't leak and someone small to read to before supper." Her voice softened. "And now," he didn't look away, "now I think that picture still fits, just looks different than I expected." She stepped closer, her fingers brushing his. "I'd like to try if it happens." His palm closed over hers. "Then we will." Back home, Clara stored the jars above the hearth and folded the receipt into her ledger. She sat on the porch that evening with her feet tucked under her, shelling peas into a bowl while cicadas buzzed in the distance. Malcolm whittled a block of mesquite into a spoon, the shavings piling at his boots. She watched his hands work. "You think much about the past?" "I think enough to remember what I don't want again." She nodded slowly. "I used to think I had to prove I was worth staying for. Like if I just held still long enough, someone would choose me." He looked at her, eyes steady. "I didn't choose you because you stayed. I chose you because you walked through what would have broken most and still looked forward." Clara set the bowl aside and leaned toward him, her voice quiet. "I don't carry that girl in the white dress anymore, I know. And I don't wait for someone to name me, I name myself now." Malcolm set the spoon down. "What name do you go by?" "Wife, gardener, builder of things that last." He pulled her into his arms then, not out of desire but reverence. She rested her head against his collarbone, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and sun-dried cotton. Inside, the lamp flickered low. The wind had stilled, and the hush that followed was full, not empty. They didn't speak more that night. They didn't need to. The quiet between them had become a kind of language, one that spoke of roots grown deep, of wounds that had closed without vanishing, of love not declared in grand moments, but shaped in the tender weight of each day willingly shared. And when Clara closed her eyes, she did so without fear. When Malcolm followed, he slept without guard. And the land around them, once a place of loss, held them now in peace. By June, heat pressed into the bones of the earth, and the days lengthened into slow, golden stretches that made every task deliberate. Clara rose early to soak beans, her hands sure as she poured water from the tin pitcher. The garden thrived beneath her care rows of green curling high with promise. She began tying the tomato stalks with strips torn from an old petticoat, humming quiet tunes Malcolm didn't recognize but listened to anyway. One morning, as he came in from checking the fence line, she met him at the door with a letter in hand. The paper yellowed and creased. "This came from the stage drop," she said. "Addressed to you." He brushed dust from the brim of his hat and took it. The handwriting was unfamiliar tight Eastern script. He read it in silence, jaw working slow, then folded it and tucked it behind the clock on the mantel. Clara watched him. "You didn't expect it?" "No," he said. "It's from a cousin in Virginia. He's selling off what's left of the family land. Said he didn't figure I'd care, but thought I ought to know." She laid her palm flat over the side of his arm. "Do you care? Not about the land," he said. "But it's strange, knowing it's gone." She nodded. "Sometimes the things we bury still shift under the ground." He looked at her then, the way he did when words didn't come easy. "I'm glad I left it behind." That evening, she took out the quilt she'd started piecing scraps of flannel, ticking, and old apron cloth and laid it across the bed to measure. Malcolm ran his fingers along the edge, noting the steady stitches. "You sewing something for winter in the middle of summer?" She smiled faintly. "I like the thought of us warm when the cold comes. I like planning for seasons we haven't seen yet." He touched her cheek. "Then let's plan for them all." Later that week, Clara began keeping a small coop of hens behind the cabin. She bartered with the widow Langford for 2 laying hens and a bantam rooster, trading a jar of pickled green beans and a hand-crocheted kerchief. The birds settled quick, and by the week's end, she brought in the first egg in her apron pocket, holding it out to Malcolm like a token. He took it gently, cradling it in his palm. "You ever think we'd be doing something so plain and good?" "I didn't even know what good looked like," she said. "But I do now." Not long after, a man came riding up from the south, a wiry fellow with a limp and a saddlebag worn thin. He introduced himself as Elias Harper, said he'd served with Malcolm back in Georgia and was heading to Prescott to try his hand at smithing. Malcolm offered him water and a place to rest his horse, and Clara brought out coffee and a tin of biscuits without being asked. As the 2 men sat on the porch, Harper leaned back on the rail. "Didn't figure I'd see you with a woman again, Keaton. Thought you'd turn to stone." Malcolm glanced toward the kitchen where Clara was humming soft, sweeping the floor. "She didn't ask me to be anything I'm not." Harper nodded, then tipped his hat when Clara stepped back outside. "You've got a good place here." She met his eyes. "It's not just a place, it's a life. One we built from the ground up." That night, after Harper rode on, Malcolm poured water into the basin and washed the trail dust from his face. Clara sat near the window, mending a tear in the shoulder of his work shirt. "You never talked much about the men you served with," she said. He dried his hands on a cloth. "Most of them didn't make it out whole." "Some not at all. You did. I crawled out of something bad, but I didn't start healing till you walked into that clearing." She set the shirt down and turned toward him. "You think we'll stay here forever?" "I'd like to," he said. "There's enough room to grow old in the right way. We'd need more space if the baby comes." Her voice was even, but her eyes searched his. Malcolm stilled. "You sure?" She nodded. "Midwife in town confirmed it last week." "I wanted to be certain before I said." He stepped forward, slow and steady, and placed his hand against her waist. "You've given me more than I thought I could have again." "I only gave you what you gave me back," she said. Hope. They built a second room off the cabin before the monsoons came, using lumber from a sawmill west of the Mule Range. Malcolm framed the walls while Clara painted the shutters a soft green, pausing often to rest but never sitting idle too long. The neighbors came by more often now, dropping off preserves, offering spare hands, bringing bits of news from the wider world. As the months passed, the land itself changed. The beans fattened on the vine. The hens nested deep. The cottonwood's leaves turned from green to gold, and Clara's belly grew round beneath her apron. In the quiet evenings, they sat with the windows open, her head resting on his knee as he read aloud from the almanac or whittled shapes out of cedar. She told him the baby kicked most when he talked, and he laughed, low and full. On a cold morning in early December, Clara bore a daughter. It was long and hard, and Malcolm never left her side, not once. When the child finally let out her first cry, fierce and sure, Clara wept, not from pain, but from something deeper. They named her Ruth. That night, with the baby asleep in a cradle Malcolm had carved, Clara lay beneath the quilt, her body aching, her heart wide open. He sat beside her, brushing damp hair from her brow. "You should sleep," he said. "I don't want to miss anything," she whispered. "You won't," he promised. "Everything that matters is right here." She reached for his hand. "We made a life, Malcolm. One no one can take." He kissed her fingers, then her lips. "And we'll keep building it one day at a time." She smiled, tired but certain. "With love," he nodded. "With love." Outside, snow dusted the hills, soft as breath. Inside, the fire burned low, and the cabin held the warmth of all that had been earned through silence, through soil, through shared effort, and the slow, steady unfolding of hearts that had once been lost but would never be again.